College of Architecture and Planning guest lecture program. We're told that tonight the teams on the West Coast are not playing, so the sparsity of the audience must be related to something I heard in studio today, something about midterms. And another thing I heard today, which was that it was going to rain tonight, which in fact it's doing. We're fortunate tonight to have a gentleman with us who comes from Montreal, who has been involved with the college indirectly for some time now. About 5 years ago, Hari Egink and I and a number of other faculty, working with about 40 students, did a series of studies for a project in Terre Haute, Indiana called Aleph Park. Subsequently, that has been published in a number of proceedings and taken to the public in various ways. About 4 years ago, Hari trooped up to Buffalo in the dead of winter to give a talk on the very same project. And at that time, our guest was teaching at SUNY at Buffalo and had organized a conference on modern offices, specifically the design of workplaces that were highly computerized or involved a lot of contemporary computer technology. Tonight, our guest will be speaking on the workplace of tomorrow. He recently published a book, which came out this summer, on high technology workplaces, and various authors contributed to the work in that text. At the moment, Monsieur Goumain is in private consultation. He's serving as president of Design Ergo Incorporated, a Montreal-based research and practice company, which focuses on workplace automation and environmental design and management. He's an architect. He has extensive experience in practice, research, consulting, and teaching, both in Europe and in North America. He's also serving as a visiting scientist with the Directorate of Organizational Research at the Canadian Workplace Automation Research Center in Laval, Quebec. Without going on further in all his lengthy credentials, I'd like to present to you Monsieur Pierre Goumain.
How do I fix this? Thank you, Bob. Well, thank you for this introduction. I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to have you all here with us. At one time, I was just telling Bob that I thought I might have to compete with a baseball game, but tonight is off, so that's okay from that point of view. Just to recap a little bit what I'm doing, I'm mostly doing consultancy right now and some research. Before, until about 6 months, a year ago, I was mostly doing research with some consultancy. I was working with a place called the Canadian Workplace Automation Research Center, which is a new research outfit, federally funded, which is located in Montreal, and whose brief, if you like, was set back in '83 to help Canada into the office automation age, where at the time all these new technologies were coming in, and they thought that it would obviously have an impact on the productivity of Canadian organizations and companies, and they wanted Canadian companies to make the best of automation. And so they set up that center, and there were basically 3 sections in that center, which I thought I should tell you about. One is developing the new technologies themselves together with the private sector, particularly in collaborative projects, where the focus is on integrated systems, integrated between computing and telecommunication technologies, and how that can work in the organization. The second aspect is the development of what's been called now artificial intelligence, and what applications there can be of practical use in the office that Canadian firms can use. For example, automated translation is one. It's a dream. It's not been happening yet, but especially in Canada, it's a big industry of French English, and some colleagues develop systems to to help automation of translation processes. But that's quite a complex theoretical problem as well. And there are expert systems, so-called expert system use in the office, advanced technologies in the office. I belong and I worked with, for 3 years, with the Directorate of Organizational Research, whose brief was to look at what the impact would be of these new technologies on the organization, in the office, and what impact there would be on job designs. You know, in some of the tasks become automated, you have redistribution of tasks, you have a recasting of the organization around the automation system, and you have problems of training, people feeling threats about their jobs and employment, etc., arising from the use of new technologies in the workplace. You obviously have unions, organized labor to deal with, etc., and you have a whole set of organizational issues about the human impact, organizational impact of the new technologies. And in that context, I was working with a number of sociologists, economists, psychologists, and so on these human impact. And I was specifically involved on the environmental aspect. So I was contributing that facet in a team context. So just to explain a little bit that what I would like to talk to you about is this perhaps wider context as well as the physical, environmental aspects. I don't think you can really talk about the physical, environmental aspects without looking at the organizational aspects, human impact, and so on. And I would like to put that into this perspective tonight. In particular, when Bob asked me to come tonight, I hesitated to show some of my own work, and then I decided that that work is not that spectacular and needs a lot of explaining on the social aspects and organizational aspects which are related to it. It's not sort of PA front page material, as it were, you know, and I decided that rather than discuss that specifically, I would rather talk about the issues which I and my colleagues are addressing back in Montreal. So I would like the light down. Thank you. I hope I use this gadget properly. Oops. Excuse me. I'm not doing things right. Okay, sorry about that. So this is the book that I didn't touch anything. What happened? This is the book that Bob was referring to, which came out recently, and where, in fact, Bob and Harry Egging contributed a chapter about the Adolph Park project that some of you, I suppose, have heard about. And on the right-hand side is the conference that I organized with the Faculté de l'Aménagement at the University of Montreal on the theme of tomorrow's workplaces. That's the poster there. And as you can see from at the top there, the 4 balls were meant to symbolize the interaction between the major facets, all the technologies themselves in blue, the participation aspect, that is, say, how organizations participate in using the technologies and developing environments which are appropriate for the use of these technologies, as well as using the technologies in the design process and facility management software and so on for simulation. And finally, the impact, organizational impact, particularly of the new technologies, and indirectly the impact that these have on the functioning of organizations. And then the synthesis being the design process. How does all that affect the existing design professions? and can we draw conclusions about it? So that was relatively recently. We had a good conference on these topics. And I think what came out of it from the people who were participating in the conference was that really high technologies are here and are here to stay with us. And we are really at the beginning of a whole new era of these technologies becoming socially available on a very wide scale and affecting all sort of activities. So I just thought I would first show the ubiquity of these two things that everybody uses for all sort of things, you know, like coming into the kitchen now. All sort of people use them, like Santa Claus and St. Peter too. I kind of like these cartoons, so I thought I would show them to you and share them with you. And you use them really everywhere. It's ubiquitous spatially as well. You use it in your car as well as up in the Himalayas. You can be hooked up through networks and using advanced technologies in all sort of places. Now, it might be interesting to see now a little bit how we have arrived to that. What is the historical evolution that we have? And some of the impacts that these technologies have had, by the way, are things that I was just talking about, you know, the unemployment that are threatening a lot of people, obsolescence, you know, the equipment coming in and going out before you know it, it's already out of date, you have to replace it and so on, and adapt it to the new work environment. So that, in fact, a lot of people in the workplace feel threatened by the technologies. Some even would say that it's public enemy number one. Some people are a bit dubious about all the claims that are flying around about the use of screens, particularly work with VDT units. I was, by the way, just about a month ago at the second international conference on work with display units, which was held in Montreal, where a lot of research work is going on the health aspect of the use of screens. Does the radiation generated cause any health problems? Does it cause all the various things which are listed up there? There's a considerable research. In fact, at that conference I just mentioned, there was a whole Swedish contingent doing very extensive research about women workers, for example, and the miscarriage factor, use of screens, and so on. Just on that factor, amongst others, there is no conclusive evidence now, except that to say that there is nothing which has emerged that people can be sure of so far. So there are all sort of questions that one asks about these. And as I said before getting into it, I would like to retrace a little bit of the history of how we came to this so-called information revolution that we can see on the right-hand side. I symbolize it with the Lloyd's building by Richard Rogers, Lloyd's Insurance building, which is really the knowledge worker, if you like, the information building. And on the left-hand side, the Industrial Revolution building of mechanization. So on the right, automation, on the left, mechanization, on the right, the brain power, on the left, brawn power. So I'd like to just retrace a little bit some of the major milestones to refresh our memory. Did you know that the lead pencil was invented in 1858? That's an interesting piece of information for the work of the office. The office as we know it today was really only gelled as building type run about Victorian times, so it's not that old in fact. And we began to see in 1867 the typewriter and the telephone, 1876, in 79, can you hear me with this? Yeah? In 79 the first commercial indoor lighting systems were implemented. The adding machine in 1888, Xerox in 39. The first commercial computer, which in those days were gigantic machines, began to appear in 51. In fact, I think it was a British firm, Lions, that started using commercial computers first. In 56, we had the electric portable typewriter. And then in 58 came the solid-state electronic computers, really the ancestors of what we see today. It's only 30 years old, if you come to think about it. And the video display and CRT appeared in the early 70s, whereas in the early 80s we began to see the democratization, if you like, of the whole technologies, where you didn't need to have special rooms for it anymore and so on. So you had personal desktop computers, and then later laptop computers, portable computers, battery operated, and then recently fax machines, you know. These are some of the technologies. There are many others, obviously, all the voice technologies, dictating machines and so on. And more recently, the input-output interfaces, which are voiced technologies that you can't represent by slides, you know, but where you can interact with the machines by voice. So there are a whole number of technologies which have appeared. Now, from the early time, run up the end of the last century, the model for the office was really the industrial production. You know, the mechanization of work which took place in industry spread to the office, and we began to see places like on the right-hand side, which very much looked like factories. In fact, you know, you could mistake that as a factory. And we began to see the introduction of Taylorism and what was called scientific management in the early 1900s into the work of the office. So what, for you who don't know what Taylor did, he had quite an impact on the organization of work processes in factories and also in offices. And here I just show this example of a workstation of the 1900s, which was developed for the secretary so that the secretary could work either standing or sitting at the same workstation for the typewriter. And you began to see these kinds of things appearing in the office, obviously for increased productivity initially. So you began to see also environments like on the left-hand side, systematic study of the work process meant that you had a conveyor belt in the middle for files, you know, because all the information was on paper. The office was basically a paper factory where paper was being produced from one end to the other, and literally with a conveyor belt like on the left, which looks strikingly similar to the kind of data processing plant that you have on the right-hand side. Physically, it still is very much the office as factory, which has continued to exist for some years. Perhaps what we see is in that line, as the office as factory, we began to see a whole trend of office design, which was planned for the process of processing paper. And in order to adapt to changing requirement of that process, you had to provide as much flexibility as you could in the building. I'm just showing this building as really the end of a particular evolution of a buildings which were aiming at providing, if you like, maximum flexibility. This is the Pompidou Center in Paris, which produces very large spans with completely open space inside, which can be adapted to any process you need. There are offices in there, but there are also exhibition spaces and so on, library spaces, etc. All the services are on the elevation so that you can actually feed these wherever they are needed inside without interfering with the layout of the internal layout of the building. Even circulation is on the periphery of the building. So that, as it were, was inspired of the ideas of the archigram groups of the early 60s and the like, and really was a whole evolution towards that. Internally, you also saw, in keeping with the scientific management principle, different systems which began to appear in the early 60s, found their origin in the Bureau Landschaft ideas, office landscaping ideas of in Germany in the 50s, and then in the 60s you saw systems like Action office system, which was developed by Prost and Herman Miller, which were applying the same flexibility principle, the same study of work processes to convert or to adapt the space and the equipment to maximum effect to the work processes that were going on. So it's this chip that has really creating havoc in some office spaces. Before you had just paper up to then, and now suddenly these little chips were bringing these machines which were meant that you had to work with boxes, with vertical screens, electronic information. And at the beginning, I think it's fair to say that a lot of offices were totally unadapted or poorly adapted to these. I put the slide on the right-hand side, not as a good example, just as an example of find the mistakes. There are masses of mistakes that you can see in a layout like this. Obviously, the regimentation of the workstations, very poor acoustic dividers between machines. I think over there you see an impact printer right in the middle of an open area, probably creating impossible acoustic conditions. You see cables trailing on the floor for everybody to fall flat on their face. You see a hell of a lot of very strong lighting coming from the windows with some screens facing these, creating obvious glare problems which make working conditions very difficult and so on. So that all sort of problems have been created. Some of them, the furniture itself, as demonstrated on the left, became rather unsuited for the kind of machinery there was. I'm talking about 15 years ago or so, 10, 15 years ago. And you had also a whole number of health and safety issues that came to the fore because of automation in the office and had to preoccupy a number of people. So now, where we got to, we have even now in this evolutionary perspective, historical perspective that I was just discussing, we have technologies just developing at an incredible rate, really now. It's very difficult to cope with the potential which is there. There's massive information storage potential which are offered by laser discs, which can store something like 54,000 pictures equivalent information in just one disk, which is randomly accessible to any one picture. You see things like integration of telecommunication networks with computing technologies, with the telephone becoming increasingly digital, so that all the information is transmitted in digital form. And this implies a whole pattern of new networks with all kinds of gadgets which are plugged into them, some of them which are shown over on the right-hand side. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail, but the principle is this also, that through these networks you begin to be able to access databases, access information from a distance. You see here a reporter through an acoustic coupler just typing in his report from a long distance. This kind of work is possible now. You don't have to be in the office to do office work necessarily. On the right-hand side also you see a current trend in cabling, one thing that created havoc in the office was all this cabling that came in. You know, you suddenly had cables for telephone, cables for data, cables for power, cables for local networks, cables for this and that. And you had a proliferation of these cables. If you lift the suspended floors of some office buildings, it's just a nightmare of cables trailing around everywhere. Now what we begin to see is the bottom diagram here, an integration of all these cables, so that eventually, it's not yet the case, but eventually one can see a time where this massive amount of cable that has to be built into the building fabric will be reduced considerably. We have, in particular, that kind of development on the right-hand side, where the same cable is multifunctional. On the left-hand side, fiber optic networks, which are capable of very wide bandwidth of information with very high reliability, so that you begin to be able to transmit at reasonable rate considerable information like pictures and the like. You see also the marvelous gadget called the fax machine that has seen a fantastic development just in the past few years. And in order to bridge the link between paper information and digitized information, you begin to have systems, intelligent so-called systems, which are able to read documents into digital form directly, ASCII format, so that you can read a written document and work on it electronically with character recognition and alphabet recognition. So you begin to see that kind of technology happening. It's interesting to see the technological trends in relation to what they have to do with the office. I'm borrowing these diagrams from a book on Designing the Automated Office by Harris, just to see how these are. They were produced in 83, 84, but I think they are still very relevant today. You can see the kind of trends that we are experiencing at the moment. So the first one, on the left-hand side, you can see that the expenses related to the office are increasingly tremendously, whereas the personnel expenses, on the other hand, are decreasing. And the office expenses include salaries, equipment, interiors, construction, maintenance, taxes. And obviously the investment, the hard investment in the office increases considerably. On the right-hand side, you can see the availability of data becomes much greater through database networks rather than accessing data through manual tasks. Now, on the left-hand side here, you can see the network cables. You can see this proliferation of cabling at the moment, peaking and then dropping down later on, one hopes. At the moment, we still have a hell of a lot of cables to deal with. Group printers, and obviously the information is still being printed at the moment on paper, but there's a tendency now to integrate the printers with the workstation at the individual level rather than at the group level. Over there, the paper usage, one was talking about the office of the future in the early 80s, and another word used was the paperless office. Now, anybody who walks into an office now knows that the automated office is far from paperless. There has been an increase. Because it's so easy to produce that information, there's a terrific increase in the paper use in the office. But obviously, as the producers and the receivers of information become increasingly automated and hopefully connected with networks, there will be a decrease, one hopes, of paper usage. On the right-hand side, there's an integration of media, voice, data, video. storage requirements too, because of the increase in storage, in requirements for paper, that has increased, but now it's probably going to decrease too, with networking and communication systems taking over. The size of the workstation again increased initially because you had all these gadgets on the desk over and above what you had before to do your normal work with paper, so that the size of the workstation increased considerably. But now with some new technologies which are appearing, like flat screens and others, the bulk of that equipment is likely to reduce. The simple sheer physical size of the equipment is going to be reduced through more miniaturization. So that has an impact on the size of the workstation too. The flat screen is, most people agree, will soon supplant the traditional VDT, which is a large box. And then we see new interfaces like touch command devices and speech recognition devices, which are appearing now on the market and are commercially available now on the market. In fact, the center that I've been working with, I was mentioning before, actually does develop some of these technologies. So obviously, for the time being, we're still, one of the problems is still to deal with this fantastic proliferation of cables, which can be dangerous and obviously aesthetically not very pleasing. There is in this book that was mentioned by Bob, a chapter on cable management and an approach to integration of cables in buildings, which is briefly shown on the left-hand side. You can identify different level of hierarchy, the feeding of a building system at the primary level through the urban networks, etc. The risers into a building, the feeders through the floors or sometimes through the ceilings, and then eventually from that point of exit right up to the point of work of the workstation. So you have different levels with different levels of flexibility. You certainly now see risers congested terrifically in some buildings. You really have a problem actually using ducts for these. You see things like this now become a must in most buildings to accommodate cables, like suspended floors, with different types of suspended floors. You've seen flat cabling appearing, which allows you to connect, when you don't have a suspended floor, connect across through the carpet. And you see also furniture having to deal with the problem of accommodating the cable right up to the workstation without being aesthetically displeasing and so on. So you have all these integrated systems with cables. Now I'd like to come to the more human impacts of these. These were some of the technological impacts. And to talk about it in terms of why the environment for high technology workplaces have to be high quality, I'd like to look at this diagram that I'm borrowing from Frank Becker from Cornell University. Basically, you can say that there are different environmental factors, as listed on the left-hand side, which are going to produce different effects on people on the right-hand side, whether these are individual or organizational ones, such as turnover and productivity and so on, and personal attainment, etc. So that the environment in between those two can have an effect at an individual level through fatigue, if it's too hot, if the lighting is incorrect, if my posture is poor, etc. These are perhaps more the traditional human factors aspects which have received a a lot of attention in the past 10 years or so. And the other factors which have perhaps received a bit less attention, but increasingly so in recent time, are perhaps the social aspects of social interaction, where the introduction of automation has an impact on the organization, on the structure of management, and therefore on the communication patterns between people, and therefore on the facilities which are going to help or hinder that kind of social interaction and communication pattern. And through that, you get that little cycle that you have on the right-hand side, which has an impact on turnover, absenteeism, health problems, etc. So just to deal with the first top loop first, obviously I was just referring to lighting problems before, introduction of technologies. You use a screen, no more paper, you might have problems. Here there's just one example of glare, from the existing background system, the lighting system reflecting on the screen. You have some pre-automation buildings, like this pretty famous building, which I suppose some of you recognize, by Foster, the Ipswich building near London, where totally glazed skin was developed, as you can see on the left-hand side, and that was back in 74, I think, or 75. And now a friend of mine called Tom Stewart, who is a human factors specialist, was brought in to try to resolve their problems in automating, because how do you keep glare from penetrating virtually all the whole building and interfering with the use of screens? So some of these buildings pose real problems. You try to generally veil reflections, as you can see on the left-hand side, and you try to introduce perhaps indirect lighting. You sometimes try to introduce louvers just below your existing lighting in order to avoid direct reflection on your screens. Generally speaking, there's been a trend away from the very high levels of lighting which were imposed in North America not so long time ago, like you had 800 lumens per square foot on the work plane, and that now is more like 200, 300, with supplemented by task lighting so that people can control their lighting environment to suit their activities. You obviously have questions of air quality and HVAC. This is just one example where instead of using the ceiling as a plenum system, you can use the floor that you have to have anyway for your feeding your cable with systems like this. Obviously, the tightening up of buildings with the energy conscious revolution that took place in the 70s meant that a lot of buildings were much more efficient at controlling their heat losses and their air losses, but at the same time, I think there was the so-called six building syndrome that appeared, which maybe have been amplified by the use of new technologies, because obviously all this equipment that has been brought in generates itself considerable amount of heat, and therefore a big extra cooling load on buildings, which has to be accommodated somehow. And then you have the problem of whether your ducts are sufficient for coping with all that extra cooling load and so on. So you have a number of HVAC problems. You also have the problems of satisfying many different people who have different feeling about comfort. What is comfort? So some systems now incorporate localized, zoned, with possibility of personalized ventilation, if you like, systems. Acoustics in the automated office can be quite a problem too, in terms of, not such a long time ago, there was one major factor, which was the impact printers, shared impact printers, that everybody had to listen to and find it quite hard. But also in the open office, and these are not particularly related to automation as such, but you still have the question of sound privacy, so that you can make telephone calls without having the feeling of being heard all the time, or being disturbed by other people conversing and so on in your own workspace. I was just putting that on the right-hand side to show that some elements of building elements, one has to be careful about the actual performance of these. These just show that at the top, the claim performance by the manufacturer. The second line is the actual performance, and the third one is the performance, in fact, after installation and after use. And you can see that these three things don't always coincide, and one has to take these into account too in high technology workplaces. Now, the name of my firm is called Design Ergo, and that's a conglomerate of Design Ergo. Ergo standing for ergonomics. In Canada, I'm also a human factors specialist as well as an architect. And for those of you who perhaps don't know about it, there's a definition of what ergonomics is about, and this has a whole new field of application of ergonomics has emerged with automation. So here we are, the study of the relationship between human beings and machines, especially in terms of physiological, psychological, and technological requirements. It's also called sometimes human engineering or human factors. It's pretty much in the line, I think, of the sort of Tayloristic development that I showed earlier, of the turn of the century of interfacing people scientifically with their equipment, with machines. On the right-hand side, you begin to see some of the factors, height and eyesight and posture, etc. All these factors. I think personally that these kinds of economic problems with the kind of equipment that we have today in the workplace have pretty much been solved. Standards are emerging in most countries for that kind of workplace, which specify all the desirable criteria, variables, if you like, and these problems have emerged. But obviously the technologies themselves constantly improve, constantly change, so that the standards which have been developed constantly have to be adapted to the new technologies. For example, if and when flat screens become widely available in the office, you'll have to adjust standards to suit. So, as I said before, this is very much in the line of Taylorist thinking. At the turn of the century, you began to develop secretaries' workstations like you have on the left-hand side to accommodate the typewriter, and now you develop these kinds of workstations to accommodate the screen work. And obviously, in the office now you have a whole range of equipment. For those who went to New York perhaps 2 weeks ago, there was a Designers Saturday. In Chicago, there's a big neocon furniture show every year in June, which shows all the manufacturers' development for the automated office, like you begin to see here, trying to accommodate these all these machines that we have, and how to still have place to do the paperwork as well as the automated work. On the right-hand side, for example, you have the race system, where you have a internal support, sort of access there, which supports the system as well as brings the cables. And along the same thinking, you have had a number of studies because of the increased investment, if you like, into the workplace, which has been necessary. This furniture and that kind of office landscaping doesn't come free. a lot of studies, not a lot of studies, but some studies have focused on, can we demonstrate the benefits of all this design, of all this new furniture which is appearing? Can we demonstrate what environmental factors are going to impact on various aspects of performance in the office? And can you demonstrate somehow a link of effectiveness and eventually a bottom line? Can you put figures on this? Can you say that if you invest so much on such equipment, you are going to reduce absenteeism, health, medical problems, etc., and increase the efficiency of your organization by so much, and therefore it's worth investing. So it's that kind of argument which has led to some studies like this one by the Buffalo Organization for Social and Technological Innovation, BOSTI, looking at using office design to increase productivity. On the right-hand side is the kind of factors that they looked at. The left-hand column, the environmental satisfaction, the ease of communication, the job satisfaction, and the job performance. And then they looked at all these facets of performance, environmental performance, and began to see what were the interactions. That was a 5-year study with $1.5 million invested by a conglomerate of furniture manufacturers, particularly Westinghouse. And that produced this pretty massive study, one of the major ones, which led to that kind of, work. On the left-hand side is the sort of things that, as I said, they calculated a bottom line figure as to the benefits of these things. And they did conclude that you could offset the or pay back the equipment, the extra capital invested, very often in a period less than 2 years from, sorry? Focus, I don't have anything to focus on this. Is there somebody up there to focus? I hope it's not my slide. Anyway, these are some of the factors that they were looking at, and literally having bottom line figures for calculating these. That's, I think, the best it gets. Sorry. Oh, sorry, I wanted to come back to that one. Oh, I'm getting all mixed up there. Yeah, on the right-hand side, I just want to mention some thing which are in that book, the chapter by Becker, where the factors of overall quality of laboratories were shown to relate to the perceived departmental influence of different departments in different universities, so that you can see the two curves, those with a low influence having a low satisfaction rate of on the quality of their labs, and their high influence departments having the reverse. You can see that quite clearly. So a number of studies, there are many others which I don't have time to go into, have tried to demonstrate that through studies that quality pays, in other words. Yes. Okay, if I come back to what I had before, coming down to the bottom loop now, there's a whole number of social trends which are emerging due to the evening out, if you like, of the activities that one has in one's life. What one see, I mean, this is really very diagrammatic, just to illustrate the point, that whereas before one used to have very separate phases in one's life, one for education, as many of you here are in, then a work life, and then retirement. One begins to see much more integration of this, a lot of education going on throughout life, simply because one has to adjust to different technologies, and one gets a more balanced picture. And now the so-called knowledge workers of the automated workplace are very much in demand in terms of jobs. Both organizations try to attract and retain these knowledge workers and are competing for these very often. And strangely or interestingly enough, the environment part is shown to be in many cases an important part of the, if you like, job package that can be offered to knowledge workers. So that it's, if you like, a work style that's sometimes sold to these. We are getting away from the office as factory, that I was showing at the beginning of the century, with a whole different style. You see that kind of ads coming into the press, about health in the office, and even that, I don't know if some of you might have seen that, and you begin to be concerned with the whole person, not just the person as part of the production chain in the office as factory. You begin to be concerned for architecture for the people, with these kinds of development by Herman Miller, ethos space. Just the name ethos space speaks for itself, I think. Being ethical, you begin to see some interesting development of office design, like this one at Apeldoorn by Herman Hertzberger. This was an interesting development which was pretty much a lonely one for quite a long time, where instead of having the open bureau Landschaft pulpit, if you like, as trying to break up the space to provide some smaller group spaces which can be personalized by the people and imprinted with their own personality, a little bit like your home, so that you have this fairly complex volumetric arrangement with circulations. The circulations also distributing the services up to the workstation. You begin to see some alternative ways of thinking about offices. This was quite an influential building. You have more issues which are of a social nature, which are coming to the fore, issues of privacy, both physical and electronic, privacy of your documents, accessibility of your documents. Do you have sole access or no? So these are security problems related to it, but also the whole issue of whether you have acoustic privacy, you have personal privacy, a feeling of shell or not. You can focus on your work. Status is another issue which has always been there in the office, but with the automation, one thing one has seen is that the middle management levels of organizations are gradually whittled down, so that you have much flatter organizational structure, if you like. And what does that say for status in the office? Is my office bigger than yours, etc.? When I came to this Canadian Workplace Automation Research Center, I was interested to find that the Treasury Board of Canada has a scale for square footage for office space, which is strictly per salary brackets, so that if you earn, for each 1,000 more or whatever you earn, you get so many square feet more, which is hardly a functional description of the space, but it's an interesting attitude towards space use. But these are very much issues which are there in all organizations. I think I'll go through that one fairly quickly. There's a chapter on this in that book. What tries to fit increasingly in organization the 3 Ps of people, the process of their work, and the place where they perform it, together with the equipment and the space and so on. And how can one relate that to effectiveness, productivity, and performance? Performance being a wider concept than productivity only. And that study was carried out by the Facility Management Institute, which is now closed. But they did that to look at people white-collar work in the office. And what they tried to do was to define some work styles that different people have. People are different, basically, and one has to accommodate their work styles through different work environments. So they classified people, I can't get into the details along these lines, of thinking logic versus feelings and values on the one hand, and sensing and intuition on the other. And one could have different styles of people, like what they call the stabilizers, the cooperators, the visionaries, and the catalysts in the organization. And all these people having different environmental needs, so that you looked at the fit or the lack of fit between the personality characteristics, the work process at hand and what sort of characteristic it needs, and the characteristics of the workplace within which it's needed, And on the right-hand side, you could check the perfect or the less perfect matches. As you can see, some groups were much better accommodated in the office that they studied, in the offices that they studied, and others were very poorly accommodated. So you begin to try to match the process of working, the people and their style of work, and the process of developing that work. There's a similar study they did, I don't have time to go into, which tries to apply a similar approach to the whole organization. And they classify different organizations according to what they call their organizational culture. And there are some organizations which are on the hierarchical model, some on the rational model, some on the so-called clan model, and the others on the developmental model. And then they looked at ways that the physical space could be accommodated. Now, other developments that I wanted to talk about is that in the same way as in the late 60s, early 70s, flexi-time began to appear, one had some latitude in one's working hours in the office. More recently, one can begin to talk about flexi-place, As I was showing before, the technologies allow a certain amount of work to be carried out away from the workplace as such, You don't have to go into your office if all you are going to do is to use the phone, because you have a perfectly good phone at home that you can use, And things of that kind, so that we begin to see a whole number of environments where one can do work, which are not necessarily the office. And one begin to be able to imagine decentralized organizations. There has been a lot of fuss made about the so-called cottage industries, and obviously there are problems about the impact that these have on family life, when people begin to work a lot at home and how that can be accommodated and so on. But one begin to see these different types of office workplaces which are not the office, and that's another trend. We begin to see the use of the technologies for meetings as well, both video conferencing, computing, teleconferencing. That's not been very widespread development up to now, I think, particularly because the technology is still pretty expensive, but one can envision that the technology would become cheaper, and in that case, that reduces the amount of traveling that's really necessary. I mean, I didn't need to come down here. I could have spoken through a video conference as well. And we begin to see some increasing mixed-use development in high-technology workplaces, where different places incorporate production as well as office and laboratories, research labs, and so on, all in the same facilities. Another trend which is discussed in one of the chapters of the book is the retrofit aspect. There's a lot of, I think, architecture students think very often that they are going to mostly design new projects, new buildings, and so on. The slide on the left-hand side just shows where the actual work is, building design and construction, in terms of new construction in white, and reuse construction, or reconstruction, if you like, and retrofit. As you can see, there's been an enormous trend towards retrofitting, becoming more and more where the work is. The proportion is huge compared to new building, so that, in fact, where automation is going to be is how you're going to incorporate all these new problems that I've been talking about and respond to them in existing facilities. Thread wiring through and things like this. On the right-hand side, just a slide showing the kind of work that so-called knowledge worker actually does. Production of documents is a relatively less important aspect. In fact, meetings, including telephone meetings, is a huge proportion of these workers' daily timetable, if you like. And so their offices, one has to give a lot of consideration to the appropriateness of meeting spaces, both formal meeting spaces, but also informal meeting spaces where one can discuss problems in a more informal way over coffee and so on, introduce a certain amount of serendipity in the meeting of different people and so on. That was just showing the tremendous integration which is occurring in the workplace in terms of processing, storing, and transmitting information. On the left hand, the three first columns being what we're familiar with so far. On the right hand side, the sort of things which are increasingly the norm now in offices, and you can see the orbit office buildings and information technology, which tries to classify organizations and begin to see how organizations change in terms of nature of the change and in terms of the nature of the work they do. And we begin to see a move diagonally, increasingly so with less routine work and another development that you might have heard of is what's been called the smart buildings. Apart from all the systems that I've just been talking about, increasingly buildings themselves can use the automation to control themselves, to monitor their own performance and to adjust it to changing weather patterns, to changing needs of the occupants, so that with appropriately placed sensors, one can change the performance of the external envelope of the building and adjust it, or monitor the lights
turn them off when there's no occupants in the particular zone, and so on. So one can talk about buildings becoming laboratories. I think that's quite an important idea also, which is emerging. In the same way as on the right-hand side, you can see a chair which is for economic research labs, where you can measure exactly the anthropometrics and biomechanics of the human body in response to a chair. You can begin to talk about the building as a laboratory where you can monitor its performance much more better than you could do before, and therefore you can develop increasingly accurate model of the building's performance and improve your models and validate your models increasingly accurately through that process, and we'll begin to be able to do that. So really, all I'm saying right now is that quality is worth it, that very often people forget that some 25% of company assets are invested in the facilities, and that one can offset the expenses less than 2 years. Another aspect being the security problem. Obviously, before you only had paper and pencil, say, in an office, security was relatively less of a problem. Now that you have all these very high investment in office buildings, you obviously immediately also have a security problem that you have to take care of. So I just want to show you some possibilities which are being explored too. These just a view of a hypothetical office of the future. As you can see, that there is no keyboard, because now the hypothesis is that you are interacting by voice and by touch entirely, and so you could have that kind of office environment. Others have been visualized here with various screens for displays, flat screen displays which accommodate different communication devices, informal meeting like this leaning piece of furniture there, which is simply helping, if you like, informal conversation between people. Various aspects with acoustic absorbers in the ceiling, video cameras in various places, monitoring the buildings for security and so on. So it's just some people who have been trying to envision what that is. Other developments are that the automation at the beginning started really with the secretary's work, one would do word processing and so on. Now one is talking more increasingly in terms of executive support systems, where the top management of the firm actually begins to interact directly with the technology themselves. And obviously there you provide some rather smart plush furniture, which is also pretty expensive. This is $8,000, by the way. I mean, that's quite an interesting workstation where you can simply comfortably interact with your databases. Others are the enormous systems by Foster Associates, which have a number of interesting features. At the other end of the spectrum, you see some artists like Ron Arad. I'm sure that all the faculty would love to have that kind of office. It's really quite interesting development. You see some developments also in the high technology end occurring for environments which are very demanding. This is NASA research work for portable workstations, If you really push for space, now you can just have that. You have your light, you have your computer, you have your copy holder, and so on. You have your battery pack. And this is for NASA workstation design. And this is shuttle meeting room design. So you often see very advanced developments, like for NASA and so on, which require considerable development work and research, and whose findings can subsequently be used and applied in more mundane work environments that we have to deal with. Also, control room design is another example where obviously performance has to be spot on. After the Chernobyl disaster, for example, you know that the performance of the controllers of a nuclear station has to be absolutely perfect. They have to be able to see their screens, interpret it, and so on. A whole number, range of human factors requirements which are very demanding. Cockpits as well, and so on. Again, a lot of research which is done in these environments on human factors can subsequently be adapted to the office. This is a police control room, emergency control room design. Now, in terms of the media, what one can see also is an integration of the media. I would like to speak a little bit about that because it's really changing the way we can be interacting with machines. We see an integration of computing, telecommunications, and media. This is the MIT room, which was developed with a combination of voice command, where you can actually, well, I sat once in that chair, you know, you can actually say, for example, draw a red circle here, or move the yellow triangle from here to here, and the magnetic sensors in the jacket that you wear actually know where you're pointing and so on, and the computer executes the commands. So you begin to see that kind of sophistication in interfaces, with fancy new keyboards also allowing different types of interaction with the computer in ergonomically more appropriate way than the QWERTY keyboard. I don't know if you know, but the QWERTY keyboard was initially developed to slow down the speed of the typist because the mechanics were getting tangled up too quickly in the early typewriters. So, but we still have them. So there are people who are trying to modify traditional keyboards. We begin to see sophisticated simulations capacities like on the left-hand side in the cockpit simulators. And we begin to be able to manipulate in real time objects which are virtual objects, representation of objects. This is NASA work where that shows on the left-hand side what this person sees. The glove there is the hand that you see on that screen, and you can literally interact with a virtual world which is entirely simulated through this mask which is being worn there. And you not only can modify it by acting on it with your hand, but you get a tactile feedback through the glove. When, for example, you open the door, you actually feel it, feel your hand opening the door. So you begin to see these sort of developments. Or in the middle picture, you see the dynamics of something dropping into water. You can put your hand in water and actually see the effect. So you begin to see how you can simulate things in a way which is increasingly sophisticated. And I would like to just say a few things on the way that the technologies themselves can be used and are used increasingly to in the process of designing, which obviously I'm sure a lot of you already know about CAD and some of the techniques, but the realism which is now possible through some of the techniques which I was just showing means that you can simulate in increasingly useful ways the real world. On the left-hand side, this is facility management software, which allows you to keep track of what is where in your facility, your inventory and so on, and when you modify things, having a relational database which gives you that information up to date all the time. On the right-hand side, you can see the incredible realism that is possible now using digitized information. All the information that's there is digitized. Or you can see how on the left-hand side is a digitized image rendering of a building by Le Corbusier which was never built and which is realistically rendered. On the right-hand side is the real thing. It is a real building rendered with acrylic paint for a competition, you know, and really the two are beginning to be really competing in terms of realism of picture. You see computer animation being shown. I can't show that here, I don't have a film, but this is a picture from elaborate computer animation film of the destruction of the Bastille towers during the French Revolution, where you actually see the blocks tumbling down and so on. You see the media used as an art form on the right-hand side, increasingly, you know, for these kind of surrealistic pictures which are shown here. You see on also the process of designing increasingly directly linked to the production process, so that car which is developed using CAD software can immediately be produced with a polystyrene machine at the bottom, producing a life-size model automatically from the software, so that you have a direct link between modeling and production. And I think that the kind of change that we see today are quite enormous, quite historically dramatic. I wouldn't say that it's continuous change. I would compare it to the invention or discovery, if you like, of perspective during Renaissance time. You know, we are able now to use simulation to do representations. Representations mean representations, you know, in very increasingly sophisticated way, which allow us to reflect on the design process increasingly. When you think about the Renaissance, oh, excuse that picture which is upside down, but on the left-hand side is a Gothic picture of the late 14th century. On the right-hand side is Giotto pictures of the early 15th century. There's only about 5 years between those. I think the slide is being put right, thank you. And you can see the dramatic change in perception of the world which has happened in less than 50 years during the Renaissance, you know, where suddenly the three-dimensionality of space is represented on the right-hand side. And this was really due to the insight of the man called Brunelleschi initially, that produced that little experiment called the Travoletta experiment, where he painted the elevation in perspective of the baptistry of Florence, and through a mirrored image that you could see through a hole in the painting, you could replace the mirrored image with the reflected image and see them coincide. And that was done in 1420s. Now that was a tremendous insight which then was formalized by people like Alberti and so on, and changed the whole perception of the world that the Renaissance had. And I would say that the kind of technologies that we have today, which are becoming widely available, have the same impact in terms of power that had at the time. So we can say now that we've come a long way, but I would like to discuss just towards the end now this building that many of you might recognize, which is the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, which is perhaps the epitome of the high-tech building, if there is one in the world, where a whole new bunch of new technical systems were developed for the high technology workplace by Foster's associates for this. It's quite a complex building, but interestingly, I find that it's quite close to another building that you might know of, which was designed at the turn of the century by Frank Lloyd Wright, called the Larkin Building, 1906. So there's 80 years between these two buildings. And you'll see that there are some real similarities in terms of the workspace and in terms of the plan arrangement. As you can see on the left-hand side, Frank Lloyd Wright innovated by producing a plan, rectangular shaped plan with a central atrium, office space all around, and all the services spaces were at the periphery, ventilation, ducts, and staircases, and elevators, and so on. And you can see the similarity with the Foster building on the right-hand side, which has an almost identical plan. In fact, to push the parallel further, you can see how on the right-hand side you have the Foster building, on the left the so-called bullpen of the Frank Lloyd Wright building, which was really very innovative at the time. So one can think that today one may be looking for the kind of social innovation related to high technology adjusted for the information revolution, equivalent to that one that some social utopians had, called the phalanstère there on the right-hand side, at the end of the last century for the Industrial Revolution, the first Industrial Revolution. So what I listed there, some of the factors which I think are emerging. One is within the space of the building, we are beginning to get away from the Bürolandschaft, the open landscaped office, and reintroducing thresholds, both from a spatial point of view and a social point of view. We begin to see things like flexi-time, flexi-place coming in. Free address system, the Japanese recently have brought in the so-called free address system where they walk in, pick up their telephone, pick up their laptop computers, and go and sit wherever there's space free, so they don't have a space assigned to them, which gives a considerable flexibility to the use of the space, as many people are working outside the office as such. You see a lot of mixed-use integration of functions occurring between office and production and development, laboratories, and so on. You see more and more efforts focusing on facilitating churn, which is to say the organizational change over time, and also reducing the downtime due to the physical reshaping of the office. Churn, by the way, there are statistics showing that American offices change 34% of their floor area every year to adapt it to new functions. So that's on average. And high information places like insurance offices are about twice that, so that there's constant rate of change that one has to adjust it. There's a tendency also towards standardizing the furniture modules and spatial modules in order to reduce the need for shuffling the office around. You move people around rather than the furniture. There's the problem, which increasingly, of how to preserve the security of that equipment without building a fortress, and in all the workplaces, retaining some openness in the workplace. Dealing with cables, it's still a big problem until we if and when we get to full integration and reduction of cables, dealing with the so-called building sickness syndrome, the increased aspects, increased simulation possibilities that I was talking about through digital media, increased participation of workers themselves in their environment because they are directly affected and they can participate in determining how to improve their own environment for better performance, etc. We can begin to talk about intelligent buildings which allow you to experiment better and to get feedback on actual performance of the building so that your models of performance are improved through the monitoring of the performance and the inventory. There's an increasing use of facility management software which allows, through relational databases, to keep tag of change in the organization and of all the physical aspects of the organization, so that eventually we can get so-called intelligently responsive environments to the needs of the organization. Another aspect which I should have put in here is a general trend towards increased individual control of performance criteria. So that, for example, you can adjust your lighting, adjust your seat, adjust your worktop, adjust things to suit you yourself. Finally, then, we were talking about an increase in integration between the technology, which is changing all the time, the management and the organizational structures, which are changing also with technology, and the design of the workplace. So all I want to finish with is to say that perhaps the image of the architect is going to change as a result of that. I just picked that from Andrew Saint's book on the image of the architect, where the great artist, creator, who was imposing his view on society, is probably going to be having to compromise his ideas somewhat, because we're talking about greater technological complexity, which implies teamwork far more, and work with the users themselves to design their environments. And on the right-hand side, I just want to remind you that all this technology does break down, and we are very subject to electricity and to the breakdown of this technology. This is just to show what maintenance can be like. When there's a blackout of power, you can't do very much with these technologies. And so we have to remind ourselves all the time that there is an Achilles heel in these technologies, that especially in developing or highly developed countries is very much there. Finally, one would say that these technologies are really concerning mostly highly advanced industrialized countries. And what we see now, whereas the East-West polarities in the world are really reducing more and more, we begin to see that the North-South so-called polarities are perhaps increasing. And these technologies and their environments are also contributing to the widening of that divide, and one should bear that in mind. Okay, thank you very much. I would like some questions if you have any. Sorry? On holograms as such, yeah, I think the question is, well, I think I did show some of the technologies which are coming up and which are becoming usable in the design process. In terms of holograms, I think they are becoming, from what I understand of it, more readily available and not reduced as it was at one time to very small areas. For whatever model is being photographed, for example. I think a recent development has been the production of virtual hologram, that is to say holographic images which are plotted on a holographic plate from computer model. When I was at the MIT Media Lab, I saw a plate which was showing I think it was the Roby House by Frank Lloyd Wright, entirely plotted on the plate from the computer model with, I think, 300 views had been plotted on the holographic view. So what that means is that you can begin to produce holographic images of virtual objects, things which are not built anywhere, are not made of balsa wood or of concrete or whatever, but are simply in the project stage. And you can begin to visualize them in 3 dimensions with colors, shadows, etc., and literally walk around them. So that kind of technology is becoming available. I mean, what I'm talking about is still very expensive, very slow, very, not very readily available, but it's being developed. Places like the MIT Media Lab, who have already, for example, developed the touch screen, they make it their business to develop that kind of media technology so that people like you later on will have these tools if they become available at reasonable prices, that is. Yeah.
Briefly mentioned the Japanese system where they get to pick up the telephone, the laptop, and go basically where they want. How well does that system work compared to a situated electronic?
Okay, yeah, it's called the free address system. The question was how well the free address system that the Japanese have been using actually fits them in their office. I think the way that they look at it, the Japanese, if you look at it on an international comparison, square foot basis per person, Japanese generally are much lower, in that league. They have less space. Tokyo is very congested, and the offices are very congested too. And the Japanese office also has a very different work ethic in Japan, which is different from the West. One talks about decisions by consensus very much, which are built up from the base. They've had less emphasis, for example, on privacy for work and so on. In their case also, they have a lot of workers who work in the field, I should say, so that in any organization, you will find that part of the office is never used at any one point in time. If you look at how the space is actually used, you will find that perhaps 60–70% of the space is actually in use at any point in time. So the philosophy is that by using the free address system, you can optimize the use of the space you've got so that the people who are not there, you can use the space that would be devoted for them, and you can have a space which would be twice as much as you would normally have for the time where you come into the office and you actually are there physically. So all you do is that you bring your filing cabinet on wheels, you have your laptop, and you have your radio telephone, and off you go for a day's work, and you have as much space as you want. So that's the advantage. And in fact, the feedback there has been is that the people who use that system are very happy with it, because the quantity of space they can get trades off against any feeling of individual possessiveness about this is my office, etc. You know. So.
Thank you very much.